Welcome to the Textile Talks. My name is Carolyn Ducey. I'm curator of collections at the International Quilt Museum, and I am happy to be our moderator today. I am happy to present our wonderful panels today, but before I do so, and while everyone is coming in, I've got a little bit of background here. The Textile Talks feature weekly presentations and panel discussions from the International Quilt Museum, the Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. The programs are held online at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific on Wednesdays. Today, we will present Quilts of Emotion with Jonathan Gregory and Bridget Long. Next week, the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles will present Weaving the Forgotten Women of Science into the Fabric of History. As an attendee of today's Textile Talk, you will receive an email with a link to register for that program. Thank you to all of our sponsors who make it possible for us to provide these Textile Talks for free. Thank you to Moda Fabrics, Aurifil, C&T Publishing, equilter.com, Handy Quilter, Attached Ink / Mistyfuse, Artistic Artifacts, 9 Patch Fabrics, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. Now it's my honor to present today's speakers. Jonathan Gregory is Assistant Curator of Exhibitions at the International Quilt Museum. He has a master's degree in textile history with an emphasis in quilt studies and his doctorate in human sciences with a specialization in textiles, both from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Jonathan is co-editor of World Quilts, The American Story, and is a contributing author to various IQM publications. He has curated IQM exhibitions, including Covering the War, American Quilts in Times of Conflict, and The Engineer Who Could, Ernest Haight's Half-Century of Quilt Making. Bridget Long is a textile historian, a visiting research fellow in history at the University of Hertfordshire, and a past president of the Quilters Guild of the British Isles. She is an advisor to the Quilters Guild collection. Bridget is an associate fellow of the International Quilt Museum. She became interested in the history of emotion while researching her history doctorate examining British patchwork in the 18th century. When she uncovered needlewomen's thoughts about sewing recorded in diaries and reminiscences, she appreciated that emotions felt then were no different than those experienced by quilters today. If you have any questions during today's program, we encourage you to type them into the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. With that, welcome Jonathan and Bridget.
Well, hello. I am going to start a screen share with you. All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here today with all of you and to share the Textile Talk about the most recent exhibition at the International Quilt Museum, Quilts of Emotion. And we have Bridget Long joining us, and I'm going to just show you an image here of Traces of Lost Souls, an image that you're going to see behind Bridget as she speaks and introduces herself and the topic today. So Bridget, let me turn it back to you, and we're going to stop the screen share just so we can get a glimpse of you. All right.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm absolutely delighted to be working with my friend Jonathan again. I've had a connection with the International Quilt Museum since 2002, and Jonathan and I worked on a previous exhibition, Elegant Geometry, which was in the early 2011, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was 2011.
Yeah. The background behind how we've got to where we are now is that when I was researching British patchwork in the 18th century, I was finding just a small treasure trove of women's diaries from the period that actually articulated their thoughts about their emotions, their lives, their hopes while they were sewing. And what I found led me on to exploring the history of emotion, which is quite a popular current theme in the world of history studies. And it led on to a paper I wrote for Textile, Cloth and Culture. My background is sewing, and I've sewn for most of my life and really understand the feelings that people have while they're sewing by machine or by hand. And I was able to make a connection between what the 18th century women were telling me in their diaries and what we find recorded in blogs, letters, papers, and all the other pieces that we see today. The difference between the 18th century and the 19th century and the 21st century is that we are literate and we're able to record our thoughts. Whereas when I was studying, it was very rare to find anybody who talked about the mundane. Most people were talking about the spectacular and the important activities in their life, and sewing is just taken for granted. So I think we must regard quilts in a collection like the International Quilt Study Centre, now museum, as having their stories embedded in them, but not documented anywhere else. The museum has a wonderful collection of pieces made by anonymous makers, but they also have plenty of clues about what the makers felt while they were producing their pieces. This gave me the idea to approach the museum and ask them if they would consider a different kind of exhibition for the museum, because it won't be showcasing a coherent collection of outstanding pieces showing technique or provenance. It shows a collection of quilts that are only united by the emotion we can get from them. And this is where we are now. And Jonathan and I will take you through the gallery today, making you understand how we made our choices and what we're able to uncover while we were doing our research. Now, the piece behind me by Charlotte Eade has an important connection to me because I have experienced family bereavement over the last few years. And I saw this piece last year when Charlotte was exhibiting with quilt art in the UK. And she started making the piece just after her mother died. And during the making, her brother died. And it really spoke to me, the title and also what you can see in the piece. So that now hangs in my house and it's what you see behind me. Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
You're welcome. This exhibition just opened on Friday, so it is brand new, and we have some installation views that we'll walk through with you. As Bridget was saying, without not having a theme of a particular style or some other thing that might visually unify the quilts, they are unified by their emotional content. So we have quite a diverse group of quilts, and we needed to come up with a design that gave each quilt sort of its own space or a way to talk with some that it seemed to visually connect with, but provide some interruptions to views so we could enjoy individual pieces. So in the foreground here is Event Horizon, and we'll go through a look at each of these quilts in more detail. And Bridget, feel free to jump in at any time
Yeah,
know,
one of the ways we felt we could connect the pieces is by both finding images of people sewing, either solitary state or in groups, but also using some of the quotes I had found in the past. And anybody who hasn't ever looked at the Cooper and Buford book about quilters in Texas documenting their oral history will have missed a great book, and quite a few of the quotations are from that source, along with my wonderful Sarah Hurst from the 18th century, who had a riotous time quilting with her aunts.
In the exhibition, we have pieces that are contemporary and historical, American, Japanese, Indian. There's a Sujani here on the right from India. A Japanese boro cloth is flat there on the table near the wall. And we integrated these photographs as much as possible, just to give a sense of the solitary and social spaces in which some of this sewing may have occurred. We're very pleased we were able to bring out the quilt, the large quilt you see, the Women in Struggle quilt. And again, we'll get back to this one, but it's the first time we've had an exhibition that's just perfect for that piece. And we're so pleased we could have it out. So Bridget, I think we're going to go through these for you all. We're going to go through these in sort of groups of solitary quilting, social quilting, craftivist quilting, and to introduce this section on solitary quilting, Bridget, what would you say are the emotional ranges that are part of solitary quilting?
Anybody who sews knows that it's so repetitive, whether you're actually taking a needle through cloth or running endless seams through a sewing machine. And this repetitive work, which one of my diarists in the 18th century described as mechanical, allows the mind to fly free, you could say, and ponder on other things. And it helps in lots of ways. It helps people calm themselves, which I'm sure is what Hattie Woodall felt when she was talking about going through bad times in Western Texas in the early part of the 20th century, as did Sarah Hurst in the 18th century, when she actually said she loved needlework, which she called work, because it distracted her from worrying about her husband-to-be, who served in the Marines and was involved abroad during the 7 Years' War. Another way sewing alone gives you a time just to think about your religion or your beliefs, work your way through something you've read, or if you're Jane Austen, the famous authoress, you can sew and work out plots for your books while you're doing it.
I wish I could do that.
Yeah.
I can't come up with a plot for anything.
Nieces describes Jane sitting in the corner of a room, sewing quietly, and then every so often she would jump up and rush across to her famous desk table, write something down in her writing, and then feel satisfied and go back and sit down and carry on her sewing again.
I think I'll start out by talking about one of the quilts we have in this exhibition, Bridget.
Yes, do, because you're the expert.
Well, I spent a little time studying Ernest Haight of David City, Nebraska. Star of St. Louis is a quilt that he made in the 1970s. We acquired a number of his quilts from his family in the last few years. Ernest Haight was a solitary sewer. He did everything by himself on his small dairy farm in rural Nebraska. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Nebraska, but he never was able to work in that field for a number of reasons. Many of them were because of family obligations to take the farm when his father got older. And because of the farm economy going bad after World War I, and then the Great Depression and the drought, things just really went downhill for him. He'd also lost his first wife, who was pregnant, and remarried and had a young family by the time of the Depression. And after all those reversals, he found quilting, and it seemed to be the thing that kept him going. And he made around 400 quilts in the 50 years that he was quilt making. He did everything by machine that could be done by machine, and he did precise patterning because he was an engineer and had a good understanding of higher mathematics and could figure out all the geometry. And one day in 1962, his wife, Isabel, wrote in her diary, she wrote something every day for nearly 50 years. And she said, Ernest at work on quilts. He says he has to keep busy on a quilt to keep him from cracking up. And when I read that in her diaries, I realized I think I then knew the primary reason that Ernest made quilts. Bridget, I'll turn it back to you, but I will say that Event Horizon is a favorite quilt to several people on our staff at the IQM. It's just such a beautiful piece, but its emotional content is really rich. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yes, anybody who's been bereaved knows you go through a period where you're not thinking straight and you're not balanced level the way you normally would feel. And Joy Saville, who is extremely well-known quilt artist, lost her husband, Dudley, and this was the first piece she made after his death. And she said she worked on the piece while negotiating a way of relating to Dudley, who was no longer physically present. But obviously she wanted to still relate to him in a certain way. One of the things about this exhibition, Jonathan and I wanted to not only track the emotions of makers before they made a piece, the feelings they had while they made the piece, and also how people respond to how they're looking as they're looking at them. The way I responded to Charlotte Eid piece behind me. And Joy's son looked at this piece and he said it reminded him of the surface of a black hole, which is actually called Event Horizon. And we all know about black hole, everything disappearing into it, into nothingness. So he had an emotional response straight away, and Joy chose to call the piece Event Horizon after her son's thoughts.
We don't know who made this quilt, but this person may have had some sort of a similar experience to Joy Saville. What do you see in this one, Bridget?
Yeah, well, studying 18th and early 19th century embroidery, the weeping willow was a very common motif seen in the silk embroidered mourning pictures, which often depicted a classical figure leaning over a tombstone or draped over an urn. And quite regularly, the weeping willow was a feature of the background. And because the way the tree has downward hanging branches and downward hanging leaves, it's always been used in folk culture to convey death and mourning. And this is what I get from this, and enhanced even more if you see what's on the bottom, underneath the bottom willow tree in the center. And there is a gravestone, and we're assuming it's a raven, Jonathan, next to it.
I think that's an assumption that has been made. It certainly is a bird, but the tombstone imagery is very clear.
Yeah. And so we don't know who made this piece. And we know that she chose the weeping willow more than it just being a pattern she liked, because she then put the tombstone in it as well. Do you call them tombstones or headstones in the States?
Both.
Okay, fine. And I would like to hope, like Joy, that making this piece gave her comfort. Mm-hmm. Just like the quote on the screen from, again, another quilter from Texas, from the Cooper and Buford book, talking about after her boy died, she had to quilt because she'd lost spirit to do anything else. Mm-hmm. And I think we all have that feeling at some stage. Quilting was a comfort. That's wonderful, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
Yes. And in this quilt by Mary Elizabeth Strickler Phillips from Seward County, Nebraska, which is near Lincoln, a crazy quilt from 1898. It has an association with the Spanish-American War. And she had 3 sons who fought in that war. Bridget, what did she do as a result of the outcome of that war in her sons' lives?
Yeah, well, her sons served, it's 1898, in the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery, respectively, but they survived. And the feeling I get from this quilt, she was anxious to honor their service during the war. There are the initials, Wilma, George, and Joseph. So Joseph at the top, George in the middle, and Wilma at the bottom. And next to that, very crudely written, is the name of the troop they served in and what part of the army, so that George was in the 8th Cavalry. Can you see in the middle, 8th C? Mm-hmm. I think she honored their service, but to me, this quilt conveys a feeling of gratitude that her 3 sons came home again afterwards. Mm. And, you know, how often over the last 2 centuries has that not been the case?
That's right. Here's another Nebraska quilt in the solitary sewing section by Carol Joyce Thompson Falk. And what's interesting here, Bridget, is she pulls together a whole generations of ancestors into one quilt using the Baltimore album style. What do you see in here related to her feelings, her emotions?
Her emotions were driving her before she even started this, I feel. Because instead of doing a family tree, she wanted to recognize all the women in her family. Going back, I think she managed to trace right back for nearly 3 centuries, didn't she, Jonathan?
I'm afraid I don't remember that specifically.
And quite a few of her descendants she found in Boone County, Iowa. And so she was driven to create her own kind of family tree so she could get all her female ancestors together in one piece. And you can imagine the love and family feeling she was getting as she was making the pieces meticulously, because it's admirable sewing, Jonathan. I've seen the piece, but you can confirm that, having worked with it in the exhibition.
No, it's an exquisite piece. It's perfection in its needlework.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I was going to add that Carol Falk has an earned doctorate, and it's interesting to me as a woman who had broken barriers in society to achieve the things she did. She looks back at the women in her lives who lived very different lives than she did, but gives them great honor by including them here.
yeah. Jonathan and I were talking about how often people have either textiles or needlework tools that comes down through families as a way of connecting you to your past. And maybe in Carol's family, they didn't exist or hadn't survived. So this was her way of bringing things to pass down to the next generation.
Bridget, I want you to say everything about this one.
Okay, Sarah MP is a quilt artist in Britain, and I actually have a piece of hers. It's the other piece I responded to so much that I had to have it hanging in my hall. She was a journalist by training, and so her work is very much based on her thoughts, which she articulates through words, which she then sews into the piece. And she does some very, very interesting takes on contemporary politics, contemporary attitudes, social media, the kind of things that either annoy her or just frustrate her. But she also recognizes the importance of sewing through the generations. And she feels that what we make now is very much just a different style to what was made before. And when we pass our things on, unless we sign them, they will be anonymous like so much as before. And this meant so much to me because she doesn't begrudge how long it takes, because the words she produces are machine done, and she has to work out every line to make sure the words don't run off the page, or in this case, run off the quilt to the side. She doesn't begrudge that because she's doing what she believes in putting her thoughts onto the piece. And the piece I have, she actually ends it by saying, we may not know their voices and we can't hear, we may not know their names and we can't hear their voices, but when we stitch, we're picking up threads of those who stitched before us. I think you've got 3 pieces of Sarah's in the collection, but this was the one that was most appropriate to the exhibition.
Right. Yeah, I'm so pleased we could have this one in this exhibition.
Yeah, and I see one of the comments says an inner monologue, and that's exactly what I felt about solitary sewing.
Yeah.
It's a time for you to have your inner conversations.
Right, right. And in those conversations, you are thinking socially. In this case, you're picking up threads of others, somewhat the way Carol Falk did, picking up threads from previous generations, literally putting them in her quilt. And Sarah MP in describing that phenomenon. The last piece in the social is the solitary sewing is a Boro futon cover from Japan from the last quarter of the 19th century. And we have to use our educated imaginations here to reconstruct maybe what was happening in the life of those who stitched this piece. What is a Boro? What would you say, Bridget? Or do you want me to respond to that?
Borrows are a term ascribed to items made in Japan in the rural areas, which were very, very poverty and straitened circumstances. And it was a make, do and mend tradition, which we've seen all over the world, as you see here. But there's more than that about the borrow, because in the Shinto religion in Japan, they felt there was a spiritual value to all animate and inanimate pieces. And that would include textiles. So although these textiles are very worn and thread-borne, they still have a value, and they still needed to be respected. And I think it's wonderful the way this has been stitched and mended and joined together out of need, but also out of respect. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing now is the borrows, old borrows, are highly valued and sell for huge amounts of money to collectors. Mm. And it makes you wonder what the original makers in rural poverty in Japan would have thought about how much are being paid for their pieces now.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Bridget, we are about halfway through, and yeah. I have been tracking our time. So we're going to go on to the next section on craftivist quilting. And I think rather than describe what craftivism is and its emotional ranges, I think we'll just jump into the first piece.
Yeah. The only thing I can say is Sarah Corbett, who's a British craftivist, describes it as a way of making gentle protest. Mm. And I think that's what sums up the pieces Jonathan's going to show us now.
Yeah. And this image is of children in St. Louis working on a Red Cross quilt in support of the war effort in World War I. Mention is the first piece. And this was a piece that came into the IQM collection in 1998 as part of a competition to celebrate the, I've now forgotten the exact wording.
50th anniversary.
Yes, 50th anniversary of the United Nations.
Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes, thank you. And this exhibition was sponsored by the Robert and Artis James Foundation through the IQM. And so this was the winning entry called Mention. Bridget, do you have a couple of things to say about this one?
Yes, one of the makers provided us with a quote which really summed it up, saying the bright colors you can see on the left side demonstrate positive emotions born by the knowledge of the achievements in the fight for universal human rights. But the black border on the right with barbed wire in places expresses our sadness, knowing that torture, imprisonment, and atrocity are still reality in some countries.
Yeah. And so many faces are included here.
Yes, you get so much of that across through the faces, Jonathan.
Yeah, do. The Women in Struggle quilt, made in 1983 by Jenny Gurasar and the Needle and Thread Art Society in Mountain View, California. This is one of 3 pieces that came to us as a group from the Needle and Thread Art Society. This one in particular focuses on women and various places globally where women's lives have exhibited the struggle that they have, particularly because they are women. I have a detail here of one block, the Donde Están, from the Los Madres y Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo. Bridget, do you know something about this block?
Yeah,
say to us?
The grandmothers protested in Argentina because of all their disappeared sons and daughters. And the protest was organized by Estela Banesh. Was looking for her daughter who disappeared. And unbeknownst to her, the daughter, before she was killed in prison, had a son. And 35 years later, after the daughter disappeared, she was finally reunited with her grandson, which I thought was, it just about summed it up. But the whole piece of the quilt is highlighting ideas that affect women's lives. There's one in the row below Donna Esther down in the middle, highlighting how women are overworked in textile sweatshops right across the world. We can have cheap clothing.
Here's a Craftivist quilt that has sort of a fun story. I mean, I think it's humorous in some aspects of it. This came from Lawrence, Kansas, and a group of quilters there called the Seamsters Union. One of the members of that group is Barbara Brackman, who some of you may have heard of because of her involvement in quilt study. Bridget, what do you think of this piece?
I think it's wonderful because this is 1987. It's what we say, quilters have always been craftivists. It's not a modern phenomenon. It's not this decade. These quilters were outraged when a block of houses in the middle of the historic district were demolished to provide a parking lot for the bank, Douglas County Bank. And they made this quilt, which is eye-catching anyway. I love the bulldozer falling off the bottom of the quilt. But they managed to combine it with very good PR. It hit a lot of newspapers locally and got a lot of attention. And craftivists, in this case, achieved their aim because the planning regulations for that area have been tightened up. So something like this would never happen again. Right.
Along the side, the right side, or actually the borders, it says the most destructive single day in Lawrence since Quantrill's raid. Quantrill's raid was a raid by Quantrill and his band of ruffians during the Civil War. They were pro-slavery, and they came into Kansas and basically burned down Lawrence because it was a free state. So it was an infamous raid. Social quilting is our third section and last section here. And I had this great question I was going to ask you, Bridget, about all quilters do quilting bees, and is that really true? It sounds like it would be. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that as we go through these quilts, rather than just take time to talk about that question right here at the beginning.
In this quotation, Sarah Hurst, the riotous quilting party she had with her Aunt Wicker and her Aunt Tasker in the 18th century was unusual. In fact, all levels of society did not quilt at that time. There were professional quilters who made quilted clothing and quilting bed covers for the wealthier people in society. And it was only really somebody like Sarah Hurst, whose father was a shopkeeper. Sarah used to help her father in the shop, and she also took in fine work, fine sewing work on commission for people. She ended up marrying a captain in the Marines, so she wasn't the wealthiest of person, and therefore she was the kind of person who would have gone to quilt. When she got there to quilt, she looks just like those three ladies in the bottom left, I'm sure. And whenever I see that picture of the lady leaning towards her two friends, I wonder what on earth she's saying, saying something scandalous as well.
This is a quilt made by the RSVP Club in Bolaji, Greene County, Alabama. RSVP is a retired senior volunteer program with the largest senior adult volunteer corps or organization in the US, and it is government sponsored. this is, the makers here are African-American makers, Black makers, and they used the proceeds of selling their quilts to benefit their community. So they quilted together and then sold them to fund the volunteer work they would do in their community. Bridget, do you have something to add to that? Is that kind of an unusual
No,
thing?
no, I don't think so. We had a situation in Britain in the 1920s and 30s where industrial areas, people came together to quilt to earn money. And I'm sure it's just the same, but while they were doing it, these ladies were probably having a great time as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the social quilting was for a purpose to raise money, but also provide downtime from them, because presumably they always would have had other strenuous tasks.
Right.
And so this was downtime.
Right. This one was kind of surprising when we came across it in the collection. The Royal Neighbors, maybe Bridget, you have in your notes there more handy than I do, who they are.
Yeah, I had to Google this because it sounded so unlikely.
Right.
The Neighbors of America, established in 1895, is one of the largest women-led life insurers in the country, with a dual mission of financial protection and an ethic of neighbor helping neighbor. Now, isn't that wonderful that there were women combining to help each other up and help insure each other at the end of the 19th century? And the detail, Jonathan, which I think you've got,
yes.
I was fascinated because of the word camps. And apparently the organizational structure across America, the membership, which at that time was 601,000 more than, was divided into camps. And there were, each camp had a delegate that went to a camp, supreme camp, a national camp in Detroit in 1933. And since all the signatures on this quilt are from camps around the Detroit area, it's thought it might have been a fundraiser to cover the expenses for all the camp delegates that were coming across the country to the event.
Right, not unusual for quilts that have many signatures, or because the bulk of the quilt is not noting camps, it's individuals' names.
Yeah.
Not unusual for people to pay a certain amount of money to have their name included on a quilt.
And the social quilting, we know, because it still happens, it's so often a fundraising event, isn't it?
Yes, and particularly in the later 1800s. Our next quilt is from the first half of the 19th century, 1844. And its purpose was to recognize an individual. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. I think most quilt collectors and quilt historians in the States will recognize the kind of piece that was made as a gift to somebody who's respected in the community, and often a farewell gift in their leaving. And this is exactly that. It was the Annual First Presbyterian Church in New Jersey, and some of the congregation came together to make a piece for their pastor, Reverend David Hall, who was leaving. And it was an appreciation of the fact that during his 7 years of service to the church, he raised the membership from 88 to 173 people, which at the time, 1844, was really quite remarkable. So this is for him, in a way that one of the Cooper and Buford quotes I found, which you can now see, when this time they came together to make a quilt for their pastor, Pastor Williams.
And it seems that in the quotation and in the 1844 quilt, we see that they definitely cared about the quality of the quilt they were making because of the importance of that relationship.
Yes, it's respect and love and saying goodbye in the only way they probably could.
Yeah. I think this is the last quilt in the exhibition, and we put it here in the social category. A little bit of a guess for us. We don't know exactly how, the context for this making, but Bridget, what are the social aspects of this piece?
Yeah, the eastern state, one of the eastern states in India is Bihar, and they had a tradition there of using old cloth, usually old saris, to layer up and then stitch the layers through together to make a soft covering for babies. But the technique has expanded far more, and now it's used to convey different images, and the imagery can convey a political comment, a social message. And in this case, we feel strongly the feelings we get from looking at this quilt. It's a quilt, perhaps a wedding. You can see the couple on the left, and also lots of women in friendship coming together in groups. And we have made a leap of faith in our guest, Jonathan, haven't we?
Right.
But we are speculating it conveys that feeling of friendship and love.
Right, and so many needle traditions include special things that are done for weddings and other significant life events. And so this seems to fit within that tradition. Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can move more towards our discussion. And if you have questions for us, please put those in the question and answer feature on the Zoom. They're at the bottom of your screen. Carolyn Ducey is going to be monitoring those and jumping in and sharing them. While you're getting those questions in, Bridget, maybe let's just take a little bit to maybe jump forward or talk about some other examples of emotional quilting. And like, we know that when there's something significant happening in our lives, whether it's personally or in our community or in our world, that tends to have a lot of emotions, attached to them. And wartime or conflict seems to be one of those things that have elicited a lot of quilts. The Quilters Guild of the British Isles did some research and an exhibition on Red Cross quilts from Canada. Can you talk a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, I think when things go wrong, like in this current year, we'll rally together and say, what can we do? We must something. And it often, in our textile world, relates to sewing. What can we make?
Yeah.
And during the Second World War, Canada had very strong, close connections with Britain. The Canadian Red Cross put out an appeal across the country asking for clothing, bandages, and quilts, bed covers, to be made, to be sent to Britain to help them when they were being bombed and when they were coping with the war in Europe. And all the pieces, like the clothing, the socks, were done to very much prescribed patterns. But the quilts didn't need patterns because women knew how to quilt. And they gathered together, they either supplied quilts they already had, or they got together in work groups across the country to make tens of thousands of quilts that were sent abroad to Canada, from Canada to Britain. And the distinguishing thing about the quilts is that they all have a small label at the back, either printed or embroidered, saying gift of the Canadian Red Cross. And it is that thing, we must do something when times are difficult.
I did research on the quilt making during the early 2000s in response to the United States war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And particularly I was looking into quilts that were made to give to the surviving families of soldiers, sailors, Marines who died in those wars. And something was so interesting that I heard in my interviews over and over is a quilt maker saying, this was something I could do. This was something I could do. They felt overwhelmed with the magnitude of what was happening. And so at a loss to do something meaningful, to heal the trauma that they saw happening, or any number of things. So when they heard about an opportunity, someone who was organizing quilts that would go to these families, they jumped on board.
Yeah.
Because it was something they could do. And it was so interesting too that they were doing this quilt making solitary in their own homes, but it became social as they sent blocks together. They were assembled in a centralized place into kits, and then those kits were made into quilts. But there was also social in that they were trying to make a social connection to the bereaved family. They wanted to provide some sort of comfort through this object that they had made with care.
Yes.
Yeah. So Carolyn, what
Could
kind
I
of...
just, before the first question,
Oh, okay.
Some of the comments. Craftivism is a term coined by Betsy Greer in 2003, and using craft as a way of engaging in protest and activism. And the British craftivist I mentioned is somebody called Sarah Corbett, and she runs an organization called the Craftivist Collective. So you will be able to find out more if you Google those two people's names.
Yeah. The comments are saying, don't forget the Quilts of Valor for veterans. Those are also in response to healing the traumas of war.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of you have been involved, like we in the UK, joining together to make scrubs and sewing masks to give friends and family, and all the requirements of the current crisis.
Yes.
Well, Bridget and Jonathan, what an amazing presentation, and it has really provoked some just incredible responses. So the chat is filled with comments and mostly really expressing to the both of you how much this presentation is really resonating with those who are listening today, and how it's just a particularly apropos subject for kind of where we're all at in the world right now. Jonathan, I don't know if it's possible for you to, there's some practical questions that we could answer. Someone really wanted to see Carol Fox quilt in its entirety again. Could you show that to us while we chat?
Yeah, sure. I'll pull that up again while you feed us some questions.
And Bridget, can you go into, there were a lot of comments and questions on craftivism. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I did say briefly that Betsy Greer was the first person who coined the term, and Sarah Corbett was the other person I mentioned. So I think there's a lot of correspondence and text now being written about the Craftivist movement if people do some research.
It's something that we've seen over time forever, haven't we?
Well, I think quilters have always been craftivists, quite frankly. The idea of gentle protest, which is what Sarah Corbett uses, that was demonstrated in the Douglas County Bank quilt that we saw early. It was a gentle protest that actually achieved something.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering, do you feel that there is a difference in how people are responding to, say, grief over time, or is this just a human condition? Did you learn anything in your research?
Well, you can only go by examples you've got. The famous example that many quilt historians will know is Anna Margaretha Brereton, who lived at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and she had lost some children in infancy, but then lost a 14-year-old son. And her response to that was to retire to her bedroom and to stitch her way out of her grief. And while she stitched, she made a 17-piece set of patchwork bed hangings, and then curtains and other items to furnish her bedroom. And she, by the time she finished, she had worked her way through her grief and rediscovered her faith. So those are the kind of examples we can find, but I don't think you can quantify how anybody feels after they are bereaved.
Yeah, but we certainly use that work, that handwork, as a way to kind of comfort ourselves.
I can add one thing there, and that's just in reviewing how quilts honored those who died in war. In the earlier times of war, like the Mexican-American War, Civil War, the focus was on the officers and those who were considered the leaders. There was memorials made for them, but in more recent days, every person, no matter what rank, is considered worthy of a memorial. So it's some change in our thinking, the more democratized thinking about the value of each individual.
Well, and that was an interesting question that was raised in the question answer. And this person said, you know, does not mean to be an obnoxious question at all, but are we aware of quilts that are being made for citizens who are affected by war in their own countries? Not necessarily the military, but those individuals who've been affected by war.
I'm not.
No, I don't think it's my area of at all, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I saw the question and I appreciate it. The groups that I studied were focused completely on American military personnel and their surviving families. I think I have vague recollections of relief efforts from the US into countries where we were at war. But I can't recall the specifics of how quilts were involved in that.
I agree, Jonathan. I think that there have been organizations that have sent quilts to other countries, if not for war, for at least maybe flood relief, things like that. There's certainly been organizations that have taken that on, but you know, that's really something we need to think about, isn't it? You
know, Carolyn, of course, there is the one that's at Toledo at the moment.
The minute you said that, I've lost the name of that exhibit. I will try to.
I have it.
I've got it.
Do you have it?
Yeah. It's. Oh, I did have it.
I have a slide about it. I'll just put it up. Okay.
Yeah, because a number of there are quilts from a number of different collections.
Here it is. It's called Radical Tradition at the Toledo Museum of Art through February 14th.
Yeah, this comes from Jen Guraka again, Needle and Thread Art Society. This was made at an earlier period after the bombing of a hospital in Vietnam by US forces during the Vietnam War. And this was a fundraiser to help pay for the rebuilding of the hospital. But so this was driven by fundraising feelings, but also the people circulated for the signatures were mostly people who were on the anti-Vietnam War side. And it was asking them to express their opinions anti-Vietnam War at a time when it wasn't politically acceptable for everybody to do so. So it's people like Gloria Steinem and Barry Goldwater and Joan Baez and Linus Pauling have all put their names to this piece.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a thing of beauty, is it, Karen?
It's simple, but it's remarkably evocative, isn't it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the exhibition in Toledo because it ties in with their theme of exploring American quilts and what they express. Sorry, I made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't Barry Goldwater. Sarah Chisholm, Chavez,
Mm-hmm.
Lots more.
Yeah.
It really does show that activism in action, though. And Jonathan, you said there was a comment, a question you wanted to answer in the question answer about the Black Lives Matter quilts.
Yeah, someone asked if we have Black Lives Matter quilts in our collection. And Carolyn, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we are very hopeful that we will have a growing collection of things that represent the Black Lives Matter and other big things that happened in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
I'm showing on the screen now a Say Her Name quilt, Sandra Bland, one of those whose life was lost due to police violence. This is part of an exhibition called Gone But Never Forgotten that's currently on view at the Textile Center in Minneapolis through June 12. Carolyn, what would you add about that?
I would just say that we've been working with Carolyn Maslumi, who I think is the curator of this show, and
Yeah.
she's been helping us as one of our board members to really guide that. What we're trying to build is a more of a 2020 collection. So we're really trying to find pieces that represent just all the different aspects of what a crazy year this has been. I think Carolyn Maslumi just immediately went to her group of quilters and was able to pull together some really impactful quilts, and we're hoping to work with Carolyn to see some of those come into the collection.
Yeah.
We're getting very close to our time here. We're actually over just a couple of minutes. I think there's a couple of other practical questions. I think Bridget, you mentioned Sarah Impey's quilts are machine stitched.
Yes, they
Her
are.
text is machine worked.
Yes.
And Jonathan, somebody just asked a question about what we do to prevent people from touching quilts, which is always an interesting question.
Well, there's a certain element of trusting people, but what you can't see in our photographs is there's a gentle reminder that comes through our PA system, encouraging people to not touch the objects. Yes.
Yes. And one more about Ernest Tate. Is it common for men to be quilters?
Well, I think it's more common than maybe we've known. Ernest was somebody, when he first started, he did not want anyone to know. He swore his family to secrecy because he thought, as he said it in his words, that people in the community think that he was a little off. It didn't take him very long before he got over that and was proud of his quilt making and entered them in the fair. So yeah, I think certainly women make quilts far more often than men, but I think men tend to be a little quieter about it.
I agree. Well, I think we're a little over time, so we're going to have to wrap up. I would encourage everyone to go to the International Quilt Museum website to our exhibitions, and you'll be able to go back and look at those quilts that we saw today, see some more details. And I think, I don't think we have our exhibition overall photos posted yet, but you'll be able to see the exhibition in greater detail very soon. I want to take this time to thank Jonathan and Bridget for an amazing program and really inspiring. I also want to thank our sponsors again, Moda Fabrics, Aurifil, C&T Publishing, eQuilter.com, Handy Quilter, Attached Ink / Misty Fuse, Artistic Artifacts, 9 Patch Fabrics, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. And as a reminder, next week, the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles will present Weaving the Forgotten Women of Science into the Fabric of History. And as an attendee today, you will receive an email with a link to register for that program. If you'd like to show your appreciation for today's program by making a gift, we will include a link in the comments right now. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much to our panelists for a really wonderful program today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Bridget.
Bye.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye now.